scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night to find her bedroom filled with mirrors. Every wall, every surface reflected her image back at her, but something was wrong. The reflections moved just a moment too late, as if they were copying her rather than mirroring her. When she raised her hand, the reflections hesitated before following. Peppa tried to leave her room, but the door had vanished, replaced by another mirror. In this new reflection, she saw herself sleeping peacefully in bed, but she was standing right here, awake and frightened. The reflection Peppa in the mirror opened her eyes and smiled, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. All the other mirrors began to show different versions of Peppa, some with black eyes, some with twisted smiles, some that moved independently of her actions. The mirror Peppas began to whisper her name in unison, their voices echoing from every surface. As the whispers grew louder, the mirrors started to crack, spider-webbing outward from where each reflection stood. Peppa pressed her hands against her ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside her head. Suddenly, all the reflections stopped moving and stared directly at her with hollow, empty eyes. The real Peppa realized with growing horror that she could no longer see her own reflection anywhere. She had become invisible to the mirrors, while the false Peppas remained. The mirror Peppas began to step forward, their hands pressing against the glass from the inside, trying to break through into her world. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was playing in her room when she noticed her favorite teddy bear, Teddy, was looking different. His button eyes seemed to follow her, and his stitched smile stretched wider than usual. She picked him up, but he felt cold, almost rigid. Pause 30 seconds. Later that night, a soft scratching sound came from under her bed. It sounded like tiny claws on the wooden floor. Peppa pulled her blanket tighter, but the scratching grew louder, closer. She peeked over the edge and saw Teddy, now much larger, with glowing red eyes, slowly crawling out from under the bed. His smile was now a gaping maw, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. He whispered her name, his voice a low, guttural growl, beckoning her to join him in the darkness. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room grew colder, and the shadows danced around Teddy, making him appear even more monstrous. She closed her eyes tightly, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold breath on her face told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, Teddy was gone, but a small, muddy paw print was left on her pillow. She knew he would be back. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was Teddy's glowing red eyes, staring at her from the foot of her bed. He was smiling, and then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim. The Cursed Mirror, a scary Peppa Pig story. Peppa Pig was playing in her bedroom when she noticed something strange about her mirror. Instead of showing her usual cheerful reflection, the mirror seemed darker, as if a shadow was moving behind the glass. At first, Peppa thought it was just her imagination, but when she looked closer, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Her reflection was smiling, but Peppa wasn't smiling at all. The reflection's eyes were completely black, like empty holes in her face. "That's odd," Peppa whispered to herself. but her reflection's mouth didn't move when she spoke. Suddenly, the reflection began to move independently. It waved at Peppa with a twisted grin, its black eyes never blinking. Peppa stepped back from the mirror, but her reflection stayed in place, continuing to wave and smile that horrible smile. "Mummy! Daddy!" Peppa called out, but when she turned around, she realized she was no longer in her bedroom. She was in a scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Daddy Pig was enjoying his favorite armchair, reading the newspaper, when the words on the page began to blur and rearrange themselves into unsettling messages. The familiar headlines about sunny days and muddy puddles transformed into cryptic warnings of impending doom. The armchair itself seemed to shift beneath him, its soft cushions hardening, and the floral pattern on the fabric twisting into grimacing faces. A faint, cold breath brushed against his neck, even though no one else was in the room. The scent of old paper and ink was replaced by a faint, metallic tang, like old blood. The television in the corner, turned off, flickered with static, showing fleeting images of distorted figures and shadowy landscapes. Daddy Pig, usually so calm, felt a growing unease. The comfortable silence of the living room was replaced by a low, persistent hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The framed family photos on the mantelpiece seemed to watch him, their smiles frozen and unnatural. The eyes in the pictures followed his every move. The air grew heavy, and the warmth of the fireplace faded, leaving a chilling cold. The newspaper in his hands felt heavy, its pages turning on their own, revealing increasingly disturbing images. The armchair began to rock gently, but no one was pushing it. The hum intensified, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and writhe, forming monstrous shapes. The familiar comfort of his living room was becoming a prison, and he was trapped within its unsettling embrace. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, calling his name from every corner of the room. The house was no longer a home, but a sentient entity, and it was closing in. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Every night at exactly 3 o'clock, Peppa heard footsteps in the attic above her bedroom. The steps were small and light, like children running and playing, but when she asked her family about it, they insisted the attic was empty and had been sealed for years. The footsteps always followed the same pattern, running from one end of the attic to the other, then stopping abruptly. One night, Peppa decided to investigate. She found a ladder in the garage and climbed up to the attic hatch, which opened easily despite her parents' claims that it was sealed. Inside, the attic was filled with old toys and furniture covered in white sheets, but everything was arranged as if children had been playing there recently. Toy blocks were stacked in neat towers, dolls sat in a circle as if having a tea party, and a rocking horse moved gently back and forth despite the still air. In the corner, she found a family photo that looked exactly like her own family, but the faces were wrong, the eyes were too large, the smiles too wide, and everyone was looking directly at the camera with an intensity that made her skin crawl. As she examined the photo more closely, she heard the footsteps start again, but this time they were right behind her. She turned to see children who looked like distorted versions of herself and George, their faces pale and their eyes completely black. They were playing with toys that moved on their own, and when they noticed her watching, they all stopped and smiled in perfect unison. The attic children began to approach her slowly, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Peppa tried to climb back down the ladder, but the hatch had vanished, leaving only solid ceiling above her. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was playing with her favorite teddy bear, Mr. Dinosaur, when his button eyes seemed to follow her every move. She shook her head, thinking it was just her imagination. But then, a low growl rumbled from within the stuffed toy, and his fabric mouth stretched into a wide, toothy grin. Mr. Dinosaur, usually so cuddly, now felt cold and stiff in her arms. His stuffing seemed to shift and writhe, as if something was moving beneath the surface. Peppa dropped him, and he landed with an unnatural thud, his button eyes still fixed on her. The room grew dark, even though the sun was still shining outside. The shadows in the corners of her bedroom deepened, and the familiar toys on her shelf seemed to lean in, their plastic eyes glinting with a sinister light. Mr. Dinosaur began to twitch, then to crawl, slowly dragging himself across the carpet towards her. His growl intensified, becoming a guttural snarl. Peppa backed away, her heart pounding. The once comforting presence of her beloved toy had transformed into a terrifying predator. The air grew heavy, and the scent of dust and old fabric filled the room, mixed with something else, something foul and ancient. The other toys on the shelf began to whisper, their voices a cacophony of distorted sounds, urging Mr. Dinosaur on. The room felt smaller, closing in on her. Mr. Dinosaur lunged, his fabric mouth snapping open to reveal rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. Peppa screamed, but no sound came out. The room was filled with the terrifying presence of her once beloved toy, now a monstrous hunter. The familiar comfort of her bedroom had become a hunting ground, and she was the prey. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa loved playing hide and seek with George, but today the game felt different. When she counted to 10 and opened her eyes, George was nowhere to be found. She looked in all his usual hiding spots, behind the sofa, under the kitchen table, in the toy box, but he had simply vanished. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen making lunch, humming a cheerful tune. When Peppa asked where George was, Mummy Pig just smiled and said he was playing upstairs. But when Peppa went to check, George's room was empty. His bed was perfectly made, and his favorite dinosaur toy was sitting exactly in the center, staring at the door with its plastic eyes. Peppa called out for George throughout the house, but only her own voice echoed back. The strange thing was, sometimes the echo sounded different, younger, like George's voice, but saying words he had never learned to say. The echoes seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, as if George was trapped somewhere she couldn't see. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in the living room, but when Peppa asked him about George, he just pointed upstairs without looking up from his paper. The newspaper rustled strangely, and Peppa noticed that all the words on the pages were the same word repeated over and over. George, George, George. As evening approached, the family sat down for dinner. There were still 4 plates on the table, including George's favorite blue one. Mummy and Daddy Pig talked about George as if he was sitting right there, asking him to eat his vegetables and praising him for being such a good boy. They even laughed at things he supposedly said, though his chair remained empty. Peppa began to wonder if George had ever existed at all, or if she had imagined having a little brother. But then she found his drawings scattered around the house, pictures of dinosaurs and family stick figures. In every drawing, there were 3 pigs and 1 empty space where a 4th pig should have been, as if George had been drawing his own absence. That night, as Peppa lay in bed, she heard George's voice coming from his empty room next door. He was talking to someone, having a conversation in his usual simple words. But when she crept to his doorway to listen, the room was still empty, and the voice was coming from nowhere at all. Peppa realized that George might be playing the longest game of hide and seek ever, hiding so well that even he had forgotten where he was. She whispered into the darkness, promising that if he came back, she would let him win every game they ever played. But the only answer was the sound of her own voice, echoing back from somewhere far away, sounding smaller and younger than before. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Daddy Pig was trying to fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, but the water wouldn't stop. It started as a drip, then a steady stream, and now a torrent, filling the sink and overflowing onto the floor. The water wasn't clear. It was murky and black, swirling with an unnatural current. Strange, iridescent bubbles rose to the surface, popping with a faint, unsettling hiss. Peppa and George watched, mesmerized and a little frightened, as the black water spread across the kitchen tiles, seeping under the cupboards and around the base of the refrigerator. The air grew heavy with the smell of stagnant water and something else, something ancient and metallic. The reflection in the growing puddle on the floor wasn't their kitchen. It was a distorted, shadowy realm, with skeletal trees and a sky the color of bruised plums. Daddy Pig, usually so confident, looked bewildered, his tools floating uselessly in the rising tide. The black water began to churn, and from its depths, faint, glowing eyes emerged, blinking slowly. They were not the eyes of fish, but something far older, far more sinister. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and laughter, was transforming into a dark, watery abyss. The sound of the rushing water filled their ears, drowning out all other sounds. The glowing eyes multiplied, surrounding them, their silent gaze chilling Peppa to the bone. The water level rose, slowly but inexorably, threatening to engulf them. The familiar kitchen table now looked like a small island in a vast, dark ocean. The black water pulsed with a faint, internal light, revealing glimpses of strange, elongated forms swimming beneath the surface. The house was being consumed, not by fire, but by a creeping liquid darkness. The glowing eyes drew closer, their silent presence a terrifying promise of what lay beneath the surface.
A scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker somehow, and the cheerful pictures on the wall appeared to be watching her with their painted eyes. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked again, but everything seemed normal now. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy Pig were having breakfast as usual, but they weren't talking. They sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed straight ahead, chewing their food with mechanical precision. When Peppa said good morning, they turned their heads toward her in perfect unison, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the corner, but the toy wasn't making its usual roaring sounds. Instead, it seemed to whisper something that Peppa couldn't quite understand. When she moved closer to listen, George looked up at her with eyes that weren't quite his own. They were darker, older, as if something else was looking out from behind them. The telephone rang, and Mummy Pig answered it with that same unnaturally wide smile. She spoke in a voice that sounded like hers, but felt wrong, agreeing to meet someone at the playground. As they prepared to leave the house, Peppa noticed that all the clocks had stopped at exactly 12 minutes past 3. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were already there, standing in a perfect circle around the slide. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others stood motionless, their heads tilted at the same angle, their smiles identical. They began to speak in unison, their voices creating a strange harmony that made Peppa's ears ring. The playground equipment began to move on its own. The swings swayed back and forth with no one on them, the seesaw rocked up and down in a steady rhythm, and the roundabout spun slowly, creaking with each turn. The children continued to stand in their circle, their eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if she was moving through thick mud. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, all perfectly synchronized, following her at the same steady pace. No matter how hard she tried to run faster, the footsteps stayed exactly the same distance behind her. She found herself back at home, but it wasn't quite right. The yellow house was now a pale gray color, and the windows were all dark, even though she could see lights moving inside them. The front door opened before she could reach it, and Daddy Pig stood there with his arms outstretched, welcoming her home with that same too-wide smile. Inside, the family sat around the dinner table, but there was no food. They all stared at Peppa as she entered, their heads turning to follow her movement. The silence was broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking much too loudly. As night fell, Peppa lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house, but instead of the familiar creaks, she heard whispers coming from the walls themselves. The voices were soft and constant, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt she should. By the end of the week, Peppa stood with her family and friends in the same perfect formation, her head tilted at the same angle as theirs, her smile identical to all the others. The whispers had become a comforting lullaby, and everything was exactly as it should be.